Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Coastal Resilience Network webinar. My name is Dan Hosfeld. I'm the facilitator for the CRN as the Climate Ready Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through monthly webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We'll provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars after today's event. We also post recordings of the webinars on our site, which you can find links to in the registration and in the follow-up emails. So today we're hosting Kathryn Beheshti from UC Santa Cruz for a talk on her research on how seagrass restoration triggers rapid restoration of multiple ecosystem functions. As a quick reminder for how the GoToWebinar interface works, if you have a question, you can navigate to the questions box and type it in at any point throughout the talk or when we ask you for them after Kat's presentation. So yeah, feel free to put your questions in there as soon as you have them so you don't forget them. And I will read your questions aloud, Kat will respond, and you're welcome to follow up with more questions as they come up. We'll follow up after the webinar with a recording and slides, as I mentioned. So with that, let's get started. I'll hand it over to Kat.
Okay, thanks, Dan. This is my first webinar, so I'm pretty excited. All right, so before I get into my talk today, I just wanted to provide a little brief background on me and my work. So I'm wrapping up my PhD this year, and my dissertation doesn't only focus on seagrass. I also study salt marsh habitats. So just a quick plug for another one of our coastal habitats that's pretty critical in the California ecosystem. So my talk today, again, like Dan said, is on some seagrass restoration work that we've been doing in Elkhorn Slough. You'll see in this video here in the background on my title slide that this is one of my project collaborators, Brent Hughes, here handing me some of the seagrass shoots back in 2015 and getting them ready for me, which then is being handed off. And then with a simple hand trowel, which is, a hand shovel, I am then placing them carefully in the sediment. And that's kind of our process in a nutshell. But I'll go into more detail on that in a second. So I want to first acknowledge that this work I'm presenting is a collaborative effort that spans multiple institutions. And these restorations were initially designed by Brent Hughes and the late Susan Williams. And a publication on this work that I am presenting today will hopefully be coming out in the coming months. So this is like a hot off the pre-press version of basically what will be captured in that paper. So this is my outline for today's talk. I'm not going to focus too much on showing you this. This is just to kind of continually reorient you throughout my talk. So let's start with what restoration is. So I wanted to provide some definitions for restoration that I feel best capture how I think of restoration. So in 2014, Powers and Boyer defined restoration in a chapter on marine restoration ecology as a variety of human interventions intended to produce a positive biological response. And the National Research Council in 1992 defined restoration as returning a system to a close approximation of its condition prior to disturbance with both the structure and function of the system recreated. Now, these interventions can take many forms. One such form could be species reintroductions, and an example of this that has gotten a lot of news in the recent decades is the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park. Another example that's more local is the Hester Marsh restoration, which you'll hear about in a future webinar. And so for the Hester Marsh restoration, in order to restore marsh that was being lost due to marsh drowning, the Elkhorn Slough Reserve and their many partners added massive amounts of sediment to the 65 acres of drowning marsh and created new marsh that was going to be a higher marsh habitat, more resilient to future sea level rise. Okay, so now that we have defined restoration, I want to talk you through an analogy that I've thought of and quite like for capturing how I see restoration, and that's a puzzle. I've recently gotten into puzzling, so this is well fitting. So ecological restoration, I should say though, is more than putting pieces of an ecosystem back together, and it's certainly more difficult than a puzzle. But I like this analogy because it helps communicate that, like putting together a puzzle, some pieces are more critical to understanding the whole picture than others. And I personally see restoration, and more specifically, restoring foundation species, as a critical puzzle piece that helps put the whole ecosystem back together. So if you imagine some sort of disturbance or impact that contributes to the degradation of what was previously an intact ecosystem, that would be contributing to some of those missing puzzle pieces. And I see restoration as a way in which to strategically replace those puzzle pieces back into their correct spot, and then you have more of a complete picture or ecosystem that is much more whole than its degraded state. So now I'd like to walk through some examples from a range of habitats that span both tropical and temperate zones and both terrestrial and aquatic systems. So we've heard a lot about coral reef degradation and these massive coral bleaching events triggered by increased CO2 concentrations in the world's oceans and ocean acidification. And that loss of critical reef habitat supports a lot, is critical because it supports a lot of artisanal subsistence and commercial fisheries. And so the loss of that habitat has huge economic consequences. In seagrass systems, pollution, development, and disturbance have caused massive seagrass loss across the globe. And in coastal prairie and grassland communities, desertification and erosion and the extirpation of predators has transformed many of these landscapes. And then in freshwater systems, hydrological alterations and diverting freshwater rivers and things like that for urban and agricultural purposes, in addition to hydrological alterations like the construction of dams, has really threatened a lot of commercially important species such as salmon. And then in salt marsh systems, coastal erosion, pollution, development, and sea level rise have contributed to widespread salt marsh loss in temperate regions. And so I'm going to briefly now review some of the strategies that are being implemented in each of these systems to put those puzzle pieces back in place. So in coral systems, a common restoration technique is to grow corals in the field and then outplant them into degraded reefs. In coastal prairie and grassland communities, controlled burning is a management technique to keep the natives a little bit more competitive against the invasive grasses. And in salt marsh systems, building living shoreline structures in order to mitigate coastal erosion is a common technique. In seagrass systems, transplanting and seeding is a common technique for restoration. And then in freshwater systems, river restorations where they take down trees and create a lot of heterogeneity in the riverine system is a common technique for river restorations. So the take-home message to this slide is really that there's many approaches to restoration. And so a key question is, what puzzle pieces do you prioritize? Because there has to be something that you do prioritize. You can't do it all most of the time. And so one approach is to restore conditions. And a really popular example of this is the Elwha Dam removal project up in Washington. So they dismantled this dam to restore the natural hydrology back to the Elwha riverine system. Again, another more local example is the Hester Marsh restoration in Elkhorn Slough that I already mentioned, where they added sediment to a sediment-starved marsh, pictured on the far right, and built high marsh that would be more resilient to sea level rise. Another approach would be to restore critical species. Again, like we discussed with the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park and the cascade of effects that resulted from that reintroduction. Or, again, a more local example would be our seagrass restoration work in Elkhorn Slough, where we restored seagrass habitat in order to hopefully restore some of the ecosystem functions attributed to seagrass. And so let's define what foundation species are. So foundation species are species that structure communities. They provide refuge from both biotic and abiotic stressors. And your classic examples of foundation species are redwood forests, coral reefs, kelp forests, and of course, seagrasses. And so let's get into a little bit more detail about what exactly seagrasses are. So seagrasses are aquatic flowering plants, also known as angiosperms. They vary a lot across species in terms of their morphology. And so you can tell that just in this these few species. The way that the leaves look and the way that the structure of the plants themselves is really varied across species. But seagrasses as a group, they have pretty low taxonomic diversity, which means that there's not that many species. There's only about 60, an estimate about 60 species of seagrasses. And the species of seagrass that I study is Zostera marina, or eelgrass. Now, seagrasses, they need two main things. They need light and they need space. And we know that light availability decreases as depth increases, which means that seagrass distribution is light limited. And so that means that seagrasses are really restricted to shallow water environments where there's enough light for them to photosynthesize and grow. But the super cool thing about seagrasses as foundation species is they actually initiate these positive feedbacks that make conditions better for themselves. So I'm going to walk you through one example of this. Just get some water. Okay, so seagrasses improve water clarity, and I'm going to walk through how they do this. So imagine the tide coming into an estuary, and hopefully that water is filled with sediment, and that sediment-laden water flows across the seagrass bed. And as it flows across the seagrass bed, the seagrasses themselves slow that water flow through wave attenuation. And then that slowing of water flow allows the heavier pieces of sediment to kind of settle out of the water column and accumulate on the sea floor. And that trapping of sediment improves water clarity. And so now you have an improvement of water clarity in an area that was pretty turbid before the seagrass was there. And that allows seagrass to then expand in areas that were previously inhospitable to the seagrass. So it's improving conditions for itself. So how does it expand? So most seagrass expansion is through clonal expansion. And so this is particular to Zostera marina or eelgrass, but here's the morphology, the simple morphology, where you have the rhizome, which is a modified stem, roots that extend downward from the rhizome, and then a blade, or the photosynthetic tissue that grows from that rhizome at a single node. And so the rhizome, as pictured on the right, is actually laying horizontal to the sediment surface. And so it's kind of like a network where the rhizome continues to grow, and from that rhizome, shoots start to grow upward and continue to grow. The rhizome continues to stretch out, and more shoots grow and grow and grow. And so for Zostera marina, or eelgrass, like I said, it's really restricted to these shallow water environments. And I had to show you guys this picture from just a few days ago in Elkhorn Slough. We were collecting some cores, and this is actually one of our restored plots. And these happy faces, this is me and one of my field interns, and this is us super happy because we finished collecting all the cores for this project. So super exciting. And even maybe more important than the excitement in our faces is how turbid the sediment is. You can see that just us being in the water has stirred up a lot of that silty sediment and resuspended it. And so these seagrasses, it's not hard to imagine, are very restricted in where they can grow in these soft sediment environments. But seagrass has a pretty wide global distribution. So I'm going to show you a map that's a modified figure from a paper by Moore and Short from 2005 that shows in green are literature reports of the genus Zostera, which includes many species. And then in the orangish peach color is the range of Zostera marina. And so the main take home of this map here is that Zostera marina, or eelgrass, is the dominant seagrass species in the temperate zone. So you can see that there's no Zostera marina, or eelgrass, in the southern hemisphere, but it is dominant in the northern. Okay, so now, just in terms of semantics, I want to quickly just say that I'm going to be referring to seagrasses for the duration of my talk, but when I say that, I am exclusively talking about Zostera marina, or eelgrass, which is the species that I study and that is so prolific in the zone, in this temperate zone. So just know that from here on out, seagrass, I am referring to this specific species and what applies to this specific species. Okay, so seagrass services and functions. So seagrasses provide many ecosystem services and functions. In terms of recreational value, seagrasses provide habitat for duck hunters, kayakers, canoers, fishermen. There's the intrinsic aesthetic value of these systems. They also, in terms of economic and regulatory value, they provide nursery habitat to commercially and recreationally harvested species of fishes and invertebrates, such as red rock crab, Dungeness crab, halibut, English sole. They also provide a storm buffer to develop coastlines through that wave attenuation function that we talked about earlier. They sequester carbon more efficiently and more effectively than tropical terrestrial forests. And they improve water clarity and water quality. But seagrasses globally, including Zostera marina, are in decline. And so I'm going to show you now another figure from a paper by Waycott et al. From 2009, and this is also modified just to make it easier for you to see. And so this is a global map now of where seagrass studies have been done, and the size of the pie chart represents the number of studies that have been conducted, and the colors, red is decreasing status, yellow is no detectable change, and blue is increasing. And so I just want to note one thing, which is this is from 2009, so this is a little bit outdated, and that's pretty clear because if you look along the Pacific Northwest, there's pretty much no data, and that definitely has changed over the last 20 years, or sorry, 10 years. And so, right, so, but if you look at the map, the majority of these pie charts are overwhelmingly red. So what is contributing to this global decline? Well, many things, mainly degraded water quality and clarity related to coastal development. And that coastal development often involves the proliferation of, agricultural development and urban development, and the runoff from that can cause eutrophication and pollution. There's also been extensive disruption to top-down control through overfishing and invasion. And last would be global warming and disease as the main contributors to the decline of seagrasses globally. So with this decline, and given how important these systems are for all of the services and functions that they provide, restoration has become an increasingly common management tool for reversing some of this downward trend that we are seeing across the world. So, seagrass restoration, the how. So the hope is that you have your unvegetated subtidal habitat, you transplant seagrass, that seagrass then hopefully expands and improves water clarity and quality through the feedback that we just talked about, and now you have seagrass occurring at deeper depths and in areas that you previously did not have seagrass because the conditions were inhospitable to seagrass. So there are many restoration techniques that are being implemented across the coast of California. The main two techniques are seeding versus transplanting. And there's many ways to seed and there's many ways to transplant, but the most common ways for seeding are, at least for California, are seeding using seed bags pictured on the left and transplanting using an anchoring technique pictured on the right. And so for our design, what we did was in 2015, we transplanted about 40 plots. These were 50 by 50 centimeter plots, and we transplanted 20 shoots per plot. And these plots were no closer than 25 meters from an existing bed. So we had that 25 meter plus buffer from any natural existing beds. Then in 2016, we repeated that effort and transplanted about 60 more plots. And these were adjacent to the 2015 plots. And we also marked an adjacent unvegetated mud habitat. And so you already saw a little bit of how we restore. Let me just actually turn this down first. All right. So what we do is we do all of this work on scuba to minimize damage to the existing beds. So in the largest bed in Elkhorn Slough, which is the Seal Bend bed, we harvest on scuba over a large area so that we can hopefully increase genetic diversity of the shoots that we harvest. Then we bring batches of those shoots up to a boat where they're processed by a team of undergrads in this video here. The undergrads then sort through the shoots, put them into these convenient little bundles for the divers, and then those shoots get handed off to the dive team pictured in the center, and then in dive pairs we go down and we start to transplant. And so just to review, we transplant just using garden stakes and a hand trowel, 20 shoots per plot in a 50 by 50 centimeter plot. And the hope is that then those plots continue to grow and expand and become dense beds. So we've done this work in Elkhorn Slough. And Elkhorn Slough is an estuary located in Monterey Bay. It's just south of San Francisco Bay. And it's perfectly situated in between Santa Cruz and Monterey. And so if you've ever driven to Monterey using Highway 1 from Santa Cruz, you've definitely passed over the main channel of Elkhorn Slough on the Highway 1 bridge. So that is Elkhorn Slough. And so Elkhorn Slough is a heavily impacted estuary. Over the years, there's been a lot of impacts on the system. So the natural hydrology has been altered. The mouth of the estuary is its artificial mouth. It's not its natural mouth. Freshwater inputs have been diverted for both agricultural and urban purposes. And there's been a lot of water control structures that have been installed over the last 100 years. There's also been extensive coastal development in the larger watershed, and agricultural development has increased nutrient concentrations in the estuary and led to eutrophication. So how does this relate to the history of seagrass in Elkhorn Slough? So if we consider the two main impacts on the estuary, which are its altered hydrology and how nutrient loaded it is, you can consider these to be our disturbance or our impacts, the causes, potential causes of our missing puzzle pieces that potentially led to this marked decline in seagrass cover in Elkhorn Slough. So in the 1930s, there was about 25 hectares of seagrass habitat in Elkhorn Slough, which dipped down to about 2 to 3 hectares in the late 1970s. And just to review and remind us all of why we care about this, well, one reason is that they provide a lot of functions that we rely on. And so seagrass in Elkhorn Slough has been steadily recovering over the years. And we were interested in asking, one, can you restore seagrass in a very heavily impacted estuary? And if you can that recovery really hasten the recovery of the natural seagrass? And so what we saw, if you look and zoom in on the most recent years, is this slight uptick in aerial extensive seagrass cover. And these smiling faces say, yes, restoration can hasten natural recovery. And so this is really neat. So for a couple reasons, of the new seagrass habitat in Elkhorn Slough in 2018, 17% of that seagrass habitat was attributed to our restoration efforts, which is awesome. And so Elkhorn Slough appears to be a model system for seagrass restoration success. And why I say that is because the majority of seagrass restorations globally have been deemed unsuccessful. About 67% of restorations across the world have failed. And so why is it that Elkhorn Slough has had such success? So there's a couple potential reasons. One could be that Elkhorn Slough is the only estuary in California with a large population of resident sea otters. So work by Brent Hughes showed that sea otters have this indirect positive effect on seagrass bed health through a trophic cascade, and that sea otter recovery in the estuary coincided with the recovery of seagrass in Elkhorn Slough. And so otters might have contributed to the success of our restoration work. We also know that seagrass has been naturally recovering in Elkhorn Slough, and that the natural existing beds have been filling in. What used to be patchy beds are now continuous, large, expansive beds. Also, water quality in the estuary has been improving slowly. And it just so happens that the first year we restored in 2015, according to the Elkhorn Slough Water Quality Report Card with the link right here in case you're interested in it. Elkhorn Slough water quality was exceptionally high the year we transplanted. It was about a B, but if you look and play around with the water quality report card, you see that Elkhorn Slough averages for the main channel about a B- to C-. And so this was an abnormally good water quality year for us, which was also when we had our droughts. That might have contributed to that. But all these reasons might be contributing to why we've seen such success in Elkhorn Slough. So let's kind of highlight some of that success because it's super cool and really exciting and super rewarding work. So I'm pretty excited about it and want to share what we've done. All right, so if you consider the initial plot we restored in 2015 and 2016, our plots have increased in total plot area 6,700% from the initial plot area. And so again, 50 centimeters, if you extend your arm, is about the distance between the top of your middle finger to your elbow. So that's a pretty small area. So if you made a square with that, for at least for me, I'm 5'9", that's about 50 centimeters. That is the initial plot area. And this is one of well, actually, she's graduated. This is one of my field interns collecting a core from one of our restored plots. And you can see how huge it is. So this is like such crazy expansion. And so this also manifests itself in the actual data. Obviously, qualitatively, it's obvious these plots have expanded tremendously. You see that over time, plot size has really cranked up and the plots have really expanded. And this is really neat because using a small scale restoration approach, we've had large scale impacts. And so we've restored over 1/4 hectare of seagrass habitat in Elkhorn Slough, which might not sound like a lot, but when you consider that that's about half a football field in seagrass, and the initial plot size was about the size of a duffel bag, that's a lot of duffel bags you got to line up to cover half of a football field. And I'm sorry, I made this slide before we lost the Super Bowl, so I apologize. All right, maybe next year. So this is super cool. We've restored seagrass in Elkhorn Slough, but it's really important that that restored seagrass looks like natural seagrass. And so one of the ways in which we can see, does the restored seagrass look like natural seagrass, is to look at how many shoots are within that 50 by 50 centimeter plot area in a restored plot and in a natural existing bed. And so I'm going to show you a graph now of mean shoot counts for 3 monitoring years. And again, the color coding is the same with 2015 and 2016 in red and blue, and natural existing beds in green. And over time, what we see is that the shoot counts start to mirror that in the restored beds and natural existing beds. So that's really awesome. So now we can say that yes, the restored plots do look like the natural existing beds. And this holds true for a bunch of different metrics, but I'm only showing you this one for just for time's sake. And so this is super cool, but so now what? How does this affect ecosystem functions that the seagrass that we restored looks like natural seagrass? All right, so then we ask, can restoration enhance multiple ecosystem functions? And so we looked at both biological functions and biogeochemical functions. And so to do this, we compared a series of functions in our natural existing beds, our restored seagrass plots, and adjacent mud. And you're going to see this in the top right-hand corner, this number 1, 2, or 3, because I'm going to show you 3 functions that we looked at. We looked at a few more, but just for time's sake, again, I'm going to focus on these 3. And I'm going to return to this slide to indicate that we're transitioning to a new function. So first, we're going to look at, can restoration enhance species richness and abundance? And so to answer this question, we deployed baited shrimp pots and minnow traps in each of these 3 habitat types across 61 trapping days. And let me just show you guys with these videos what it looks like to deploy the traps on top and to retrieve the traps on the bottom. And I like these videos for many reasons. this bottom video, especially because the soak time for this trapping effort was no more than 24 hours. So this just shows how much floating macroalgae got deposited on our shrimp pots within 24 hours. And it really kind of drives the point home of how eutrophic the estuary is and how prolific these ephemeral macroalgal blooms are in the spring and summer months. Okay. So next I'm going to show you a collage of species that we caught in these traps. And just qualitatively, it became very clear when we were trapping that the restored plots had a lot of diversity. And so qualitatively, you can see there's a lot of different species of fishes and invertebrates. And so yes, restoration can enhance species richness and abundance, but let's let the data tell us that. So I'm going to show you some data now. On the top, I'm going to show you fish richness on the left and invertebrate richness on the right. And the richness is really the number of species. And here that's captured by this cartoon of different colors representing different species for both fish again on the left and invertebrates on the right. And then I'm going to show you a figure for abundance or catch per unit effort. And all that means is if you don't care about the identity of the species, how many individuals, when you lump all species together, how many individuals on average did you catch per trapping effort? Okay, and so we have fish on the left and invertebrates on the right. And then we're going to have all 4 of our habitat types from mud, 2016 restoration, 2015, and then natural existing beds. And so all this really means is that generally the restored plots are kind of in the middle for most of these functions, with the lowest end being mud in terms of richness and catch per unit effort, and the highest being existing beds. And then for invertebrate catch per unit effort, there was no significant difference across all 3 habitat types. So this is really cool and really interesting, and it shows that maybe slowly but surely the restored plots are starting to have the same richness and abundance as existing beds, but the identity of species really matters. And so how does the community composition, so the actual colors of the fish and the actual colors of the crabs or the invertebrates, how does that compare between the existing beds and the restored plots? Number 2 is, can restoration improve water quality? And so to answer this question, we deployed YSIs, which are water quality instruments, in each of the habitat types. And we were most interested in dissolved oxygen and pH. And so I'm going to walk you through this data now piece by piece. So low dissolved oxygen is bad because that can lead to hypoxia, which is low oxygen in the water that can lead to fish kills. Low pH is bad because low pH is more acidic, and that's when you have sad bivalves and invertebrates like this oyster and this mussel that that can have a dissolution of their shells in acidic environments. All right, so what I'm going to show you is a cumulative frequency distribution, which all that means is I'm going to show you a curve, and those curves, if they're farther to the left in both cases for dissolved oxygen and pH, that means that there are more frequent observations with low DO and low pH relative to a curve that's farther to the right. So let me show you an example. So in this example, the orange curve shows more frequent observations with low dissolved oxygen relative to the dissolved oxygen curve for the green habitat. All right, so I'm going to show you this exact thing with our real data. There is lower dissolved oxygen in mud habitats than there is in restored beds or natural beds. And similarly, there is lower pH in mud habitats than restored plots or natural existing beds. All right. So for our third function, again, comparing across all 3 habitat types, we asked, can restoration enhance total organic material? And so total organic matter. So total organic matter is one step towards figuring out this whole blue carbon thing. So blue carbon is the carbon that's sequestered by salt marshes, seagrasses, and mangrove systems. And if you were to want to ask how much of that organic matter is carbon versus nitrogen, you would have to put it through an elemental analyzer and process these samples further. We did not do that. We just did total organic matter, but it's kind of a proxy for carbon storage. All right, so to do this, we collected 27 cores from in total, 9 from each habitat type, and we measured how much of that sediment was organic. And so we used a technique called loss on ignition, which basically involves preparing these samples through a series of steps and then burning off all the organics. And that's how much has, that's the loss on ignition. And the difference before and after the combustion is how much of it was organic. So I should say that the data I'm presenting to you right now is preliminary. We have many more cores that we're in the process of processing. And so take this with a grain of salt, but all, directions point to yes, it is indeed true that restoration may enhance total organic matter. To summarize, yes, restoration can enhance multiple ecosystem functions when you compare restored plots to mud. So when you do that comparison, you see that restored plots have higher richness and abundance, they have higher dissolved oxygen and higher pH in the water, and they have higher organic matter. And so just to summarize, our successful seagrass restoration has shown that you can enhance multiple ecosystem functions, and the fact that we've had such success restoring seagrass in Elkhorn Slough is something that we really wanted to share. And so we generated an eelgrass restoration handbook that was a collaborative effort led by myself, Brent Hughes, Kathy Boyer, and Susan Williams, where we basically drafted this document of lessons learned and how we crafted our restoration and had success. And so that's something that's available online and on many different websites. So feel free to contact me if you want a copy, if you cannot find it online. And I just want to summarize by saying that restoration success can facilitate the recovery of associated functions. And when your puzzle piece you're prioritizing is a foundation species as quick growing as seagrass, it's really, really immediate, the recovery of these functions. So it's super cool. You get a lot of bang for your buck with restoring seagrass. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the undergrads that have helped on this project. There are so many of them. My project collaborators, Brent Hughes, Susan Williams, Kathy Boyer, Charlie Endres, Tracy Grimes, Anna Kate Clemens, all the folks at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, and my advisors and funding sources. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Kat. That was wonderful. Thanks so much. We have a few questions that have come in, okay. But folks online, if you have a question, now's a great time to drop them in. Thank you. So the first question we have here, did you perform any genetic analysis to be certain you were not restoring different populations?
The short answer is no. We did not. We did not.
Okay, yeah. And so another question coming in here related to the seagrass population graph that you had up. That was like seagrass, I think, densities over the years at Elkhorn Slough. Yeah. The question is, was there a dip in the year 2000?
In the year, oh, that is a very good question. I am not quite sure, actually. A lot of that data is from aerial imagery. It's possible that it could have been poor aerial imagery, but I don't want to say that because I'm not totally confident that that's the reason. It could have had various reasons. It could have been water quality. It could have been that maybe sea otters left the system temporarily because they have been shown to have this strong top-down control. But I would actually direct that question to Brent Hughes. So you could email him or you could email me and I could find out the answer. I'm sorry, I don't know why that dip happened in 2000.
Okay, great, thanks. So our
Yeah.
next question here, do you expect the relationships you've observed so far to continue? For example, will it take active management for the restored beds to continue performing at this level, or are there longer term effects that you expect but have not yet observed?
Yeah, so I think that this is pretty much a single little influx of investment. You transplant and then you kind of let things take hold. And there is plenty of real estate for the seagrass to expand on its own. I don't think it takes any more intervention. I think there's obviously a lot of interesting science questions that we could pursue and use restoration as a way in which to answer those questions, like looking at patch size dynamics and transplant density. So those are different questions, but from a purely management perspective, the seagrass in Elkhorn Slough is going to continue to expand. There's a lot of shallow water that real estate for it to colonize, and so I think that expansion on its own and the further enhancement of all these functions that we've tracked is definitely the expectation, and there doesn't seem to be too much further intervention needed, though of course maintaining water quality is of premier importance for seagrass. And we're actually seeing seagrass in Elkhorn Slough higher up in the slough than it has been seen historically. So that's also evidence that overall conditions are improving, because as you move away from the mouth, it becomes more silty and more turbid. And so the fact that we're seeing seagrasses in these areas farther up is evidence that improved conditions are generally improving.
Great, thanks. So the next question we have here, if you could please just repeat the name of the species of seagrass, and then also if you could discuss just how far south it's native to California or how far south it's observed.
Yeah, so it's Zostera marina. So that's Zostera marina, M-A-R-I-N-A, and its common name is eelgrass. And it's as far south as in California as Baja. Yeah, so it's pretty southern distribution. There's a lot of seagrass restoration work and seagrass work being done in San Diego Bay and San Diego in general. So it's pretty prolific along the entire coast of California.
Great, thanks. Do you think, so the next question is about the habitat where this type of work, this restoration could work. So for example, would this work in sandy bottom habitats?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, the mouth of Elkhorn Slough, or near the mouth, right at that Highway 1 bridge, it's pretty sandy, and that's where we've seen some of our most rapid expansion. So there's definitely a trade-off, because it's harder to transplant shoots into a sandier bottom, but with sandier environments comes an improvement of water clarity, because it's just less muddy and less silty. So I think that if you can manage to transplant, and this technique did work in a sandy environment, if you can manage to transplant successfully and really anchor the shoots, that's why anchoring is so important, it is completely conducive to a sandy environment, no doubt. Yeah.
Great. Our next question, did the increase in density come from planted individuals sending up more shoots, or from seeds being trapped in the plots and adding new individuals?
Ooh, so majority has been from rhizomatic growth, and we just know that from being in the beds and actually being able to trace them. I mean, these networks of rhizomatic growth are so intertwined. You know, there is really no way to fully answer that without doing some sort of genetic analysis, and so I don't think that, because the seeds, we almost assume that most of the growth in Elkhorn Slough is through rhizomatic growth and not so much germination, though that is definitely the case for some of these kind of patches that are appearing out of nowhere, with, you know, where the distance between any nearby seagrass is too great for it to be rhizomatic. So there's definitely a combination, but so I guess I can't fully answer that question because I don't know, but I would say I'm 95% confident it's all rhizomatic growth. Yeah.
Great, thanks. The next question is also about the transplants. What was the typical survivorship for the transplants? If you put 20 in the plot, did all 20 survive? And then the asker asks, were there a few of the individuals that may have been particularly robust and may have disproportionately contributed to the increases.
Yeah, so of our restored plots that we transplanted, so we didn't really track, so this might help. We defined whether or not a plot persisted at each of our monitoring periods, whether that was assessed as whether or not there was one or more shoots in the initial plot area. And of course, we counted those shoots, but our restoration success is basically on the presence or absence of shoots. And so 62% of the plots, or actually, yeah, 62% of the plots persisted over time, but whether or not, and overall, and then with time, obviously, shoot densities increased in that initial plot area. But I would say that, you know, just qualitatively, when we would go and monitor after transplanting, like especially within the first 3 months, sometimes shoot counts were a little bit lower than the initial transplanted density, but then that quickly recovered and more than doubled or tripled in shoot density over time just through rhizomatic growth and the sprouting of new shoots from the shoots that we're able to maintain over time, if that makes sense. And it's completely possible that when we harvested, we just happened to get the strongest, genetically strongest or most robust genotype, and that's what we transplanted. But we tried to do our best to account for that by harvesting over as large of an area as we possibly could. But without genetic testing, we really couldn't answer that question. But that would be a great thing to look at, and to look at, we could potentially harvest some tissue from plots that were slow to expand versus expanded rapidly in the same area, and see if they're genetically identical or genetically different. And that might give insight into whether there are certain genetic differences that are allowing some seagrass plots to expand more rapidly than others. But unfortunately, the seagrass plots, you know, the 30 or 38% that did die, we don't have tissue from those, so we wouldn't be able to ask a question about whether those died because they were genetically weaker. So, you know.
Sure, thanks. So this next question, does your experience give you any insight into how seagrass restoration could help adapt to sea level rise and even protect adjacent developed areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mean, seagrasses as like a living shoreline or a natural living shoreline are definitely effective in mitigating wave action. You know, that's a really good question, and I haven't given it too much thought beyond, you know, I can say that for Elkhorn Slough in particular, there's definitely a trade-off between the protection from wave action and the rack deposition of dead seagrass that gets deposited on the marsh and kind of contributes to marsh dieback from smothering the marsh. So there's definitely a trade-off between those two things, and that's definitely something that could look into. I think it depends on what your goals are. If you don't have a eutrophication problem, then deposition of eelgrass onto the salt marsh is maybe not as much of a problem when it's compounded by macroalgal deposition. So attenuating wave action would be a more beneficial function in that case. But if you're Elkhorn Slough and you have eutrophication, ooh, I don't know. I'm going in circles now. I'm gonna say it depends on what your goals are. Keep it short.
Great, thanks. The next question, what are the regulatory or funding challenges of restoring eelgrass?
Yeah, so there's a lot of permits you need. I will say that. So that's a regulatory challenge for sure. You need a special scientific collecting permit with the California Fish and Wildlife. If you are transplanting, you need, in places like Elkhorn Slough, you need a harbor permit because you're modifying the benthic environment. funding opportunities. So, you know, as a graduate student, a lot of this work is part of my dissertation. So, you know, seagrass restoration is expensive, and I think that's why I think our project is so cool, because we did do a relatively small scale project and had pretty, you know, large scale impacts. And so the cost relative to a lot of other projects was lower. But I'd say that if you're not associated with some sort of organization, or, you know, I'm lucky in that, you know, a lot of the labor I did and my undergrads assisted me in doing, and so a lot of that labor was free for a lot of it, and all of the monitoring was free. So I'd say if you could link up with a university that has that kind of built-in labor force and that team of scientific divers, it can cut down on cost. But of course, there's hours and hours and hours required to carry out these restorations and then do subsequent monitoring. So it can get costly. But I would say there's a lot of public and private funding opportunities and people interested in carbon credits and assessing carbon offsets and things like that. And so a lot of businesses are trying to mitigate their carbon emissions through seagrass restorations. That's a potential growing avenue for funding opportunities. And that's been my experience. That's pretty much all I can speak on. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So we're coming up on the end of the time here, just to be aware of that, but we have a few more questions we can probably get to. Before I do that, I just want everyone online to know we're going to send you through the chat function here a link to a SurveyMonkey survey about this talk, and if you could please open that up and take it. It should be less than 5 minutes. So I'm just sending that out to folks now. And while you're all opening that, the next question we have here, what about swell and storm damage? How do you expect the restored areas to deal with damage from weather events?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that one of the ways to kind of control for that is to transplant with anchoring. So there's a lot of different transplanting techniques, and I think that if you anchor your shoots with, you know, garden stakes that are as long as 12 centimeters, it really keeps them in the sediment. And then once they get to be a certain size, they become pretty robust. And at least for Elkhorn, you know, besides storm action kind of cleaving off some of the dead tissue that accumulates, you know, that starts to senesce, there isn't huge bare patches that I have seen in our restored plots attributed to storm action and storm waves. I would say that at least for I can only speak on what we've observed in Elkhorn Slough, and I would say that we have not observed storm damage in our restored plots. But of course, in a silty environment, if you transplant without anchoring, or even if you transplant with anchoring, there's the potential for storms to rip out your transplants. And I think that that's also potentially one of the downsides of seeding or transplanting without anchoring, is that you're not really guaranteeing that what you're investing in and how you're transplanting or seeding is going to actually result in them staying there. Yeah.
Great, thanks. That's all the time we've got. There are a lot of really good questions online here, some really technical ones from the audience. So for those of you online, I just want you to know I'm going to pass all those on to Kat so that we can make sure you all get some good responses. And I think some of them could come from the Seagrass Restoration Handbook that was plugged too. So we'll send out a link to that. And the very, very last question I'll ask, there were a few comments mentioning this, but who drew all those beautiful drawings that we were looking at this whole hour?
I got an iPad and I've gotten pretty obsessed with it, so that would be me.
Cool.
I'm not really good at tracing. I'm not an artist.
Well, it's awesome. It's much appreciated. Really beautiful slides. So thank you. Thanks, Kat, for joining us today and sharing your expertise. And thank you everyone online for tuning in. So we'll follow up with the recording, and to everyone, thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.